your Spirit upon us tonight to be with us and to open our hearts and minds to understand what you would like us to learn. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Aloysius, St. Rita, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Okay, our last presentation of the academic year is on the 8th, 9th, and 10th commandments. So both of these slideshows are about 10 slides. 10 for the 8th and 10 for the 9th and 10th. If I can get this moving correctly. The 8th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Even though it doesn't specifically say thou shalt not lie, the concern, directly speaking, is bearing false witness. In a legal system, this would be called perjury. You're lying precisely to get somebody else in trouble. But it does entail more sins than just that strict one. So it forbids misrepresenting the truth in our relations with others. Flows from our vocation to bear witness to God, who is the truth and wills the truth. Offenses against truth are infidelities to God. We are called to live in the truth. The Old Testament recalls that God is the source of all truth. His word is truth, law is truth. God is true and faithful throughout the Old Testament. So we are called to live in this truth, to listen to his word, to follow his law. And Jesus Christ is the whole of God's truth. He makes it manifest by his words, by his being. He starts to reveal who God is to us by the incarnation. And then, of course, his words and deeds are further revelatory of the truth of who God is, but also the truth of who we are and how we are to live. We tend by nature towards the truth. We want to know, even from a young age, children. They often asking the question, why? And then you give them an answer, and they ask, why again? And you give them another answer, and they ask, why again? They want to know. We're obliged to honor and bear witness to the truth, and bound to adhere to it once we come to know it. Many of the philosophers talk about truth having a coercive nature, that once we know something is true, we have to follow it. We know, for example, 2 plus 2 equals, read that, 4. I asked an accountant, so I get a truthful answer. If somebody said 5, depending on the circumstances, we would either think they're naive and we could get away with something, or we would think they're trying to defraud us, and we wouldn't want to do business with them. Truth is coercive. We expect people to all conform to that reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So if I go and buy 2 things for $2, I'm going to be charged $4. Anything less, anything more, we know something's wrong. No. Truthfulness is uprightness in human action and speech. We also call it sincerity or candor. Showing oneself true in deeds and truthful in words. This points to our character. These are the people that we can trust, that we can develop relations because what they say and what they do match. So we should guard against any form of duplicity, dissimulation, or hypocrisy. Any way that our words and actions don't go together. We cannot live with others without truth. Keeps to the just mean between what should be expressed and what ought to be kept secret. This is often an important part. Not everybody needs to know everything. There are certain, often it comes up, people feel like they're lying or not telling the truth to somebody else. And one of the questions that you may want to ask yourself with that regard is, do they have a right to know? Certainly in some circumstances, people have a right to know because that matter of truth brings about the good ordering of society. If I start to dig a hole in my backyard, my neighbors are going to be asking questions. What are you doing? And in some ways, because of being a good neighbor, they have a right to know. Am I going to build a 5-story building in my backyard, or something that's going to obstruct their view or take down their property values? Am I digging a mass grave, a garden? They have a right to know because it does have a bearing on their property values and maybe their own way of living. But yet on the other hand, if I come out of the confessional and somebody asks, "What'd you confess today, Father?" Well, you don't have the right to know. That is none of your business. And in family life, naturally, I think we tend, at least prior to the days of Facebook, tend to keep the way we raise our children rather private. What goes on in the home generally would stay in the home, unless if somehow it affects the common good, because that was seen as the domain of family life, and it often gave the children the chance to be protected from their own mistakes. That the sins of children weren't somehow then carried into adulthood. Like when you get that 7-year-old who steals $1 from his parents to buy himself something from an ice cream truck, if they still have ice cream trucks. They still have things with $1. But we don't label that child a thief. And we don't warn everybody, "Oh, watch out for him, he's going to pick your pocket." That's a child who's learning right from wrong. The privacy of the home kind of gives them that protection from their mistakes of childhood carrying with them into adulthood. So again, what's needed to know? A disciple of Christ consents to live in the truth. We are to bear witness to the truth. Christ came to witness to the truth. The Christian cannot be ashamed of testifying to our Lord, must profess without equivocation, and keep a clear conscience. So, somebody asks you if you've been saved. What do we say? For Catholics, that's a hard one to answer because it's not kind of our way of speaking about our faith life. But certainly we shouldn't make some kind of joke and make a response, "Yes, by Buddha." No, we're to witness to Jesus Christ in all things. We have a duty to take part in the life of the church, which impels us to witness to the gospel and the obligations which flow from it. transmission of faith in words and deeds, and acts of justice to make the truth known. We cannot be just Christians who only worship on Sunday. What we do on Sunday should be lived every day of our lives. Of course, martyrdom is the supreme witness. It means bearing witness unto death. The witness to Christ, witness to the truth of the faith and doctrine. It is an act of courage. We add that aspect to truth of faith and doctrine because, well, one of the greatest people to ever live, according to Jesus Christ, is a martyr to truth without necessarily being a direct witness to Jesus Christ. At least that's not why he was killed. Of course, I'm talking about John the Baptist, who was a martyr to the sacredness of marriage. Herod had taken his brother's wife as his own. He said it was not right. That's why he was jailed. That's why she harbored the grudge against him and wanted his head. And of course, the church keeps a record of the martyrs. Now we come to the offenses against truth. Christ's disciples have put on the new man. We have put on Christ, which means we have put away all falsehood, false witness, and perjury. These are public statements contrary to truth, and they take on a certain gravity, especially if they are under oath. We call it perjury. If it's done in court, it is false witness in the proper sense. It compromises the exercise of justice and fairness of the judicial decisions. Respect for reputation forbids attitudes and words which cause unjust injury. Examples: a rash judgment. One assumes as true without sufficient foundation a moral fault of another person. A detraction. This is disclosing another's faults or failings to one who does not need to know. Calumny. Remarks contrary to the truth. It harms the reputation and gives occasions for false judgments. To avoid rash judgment, we should interpret the neighbor's thoughts, words, deeds, always in a favorable way. We should give people benefits of any doubts we have until we're able to resolve those doubts. Detraction, disclosing another's faults. An example that I recently read, I would say somebody was committing this against Pope Leo. Since 2002, the church has said, and it's pretty much become common even in the state, that sex offenders are made known to everybody. Because so often the sex offenders are serial sex offenders. So we want people to know to protect themselves. But that was not always the case. In the 1980s and 1990s, that kind of stuff was treated like many other crimes. And the church doesn't publicize crimes. Or about forgiving them. So there was something about Pope Leo that seemed to imply he was harboring and protecting some sex abusers, priests who had sexually abused others. But the dates always seem to be in the 80s and 90s. So I think a different set of circumstances apply. If he was taking them in, which was, some of them were sent back into ministry depending on the circumstances back in those cases. But hopefully it was done with the sense that he knew who they were and did his best to be sure that they couldn't repeat. understanding of this crime. Any questions?
Was that in South America?
I think that was Chicago. Question, I forgot to repeat the question. If it was during his time in South America, I said no, I think it was Chicago. So, and how much authority he had, or if he was just like the pastor who gets assigned this priest, told this priest is going to live with you. So, again, that's like 40 years ago. Continuing on offenses against the truth. Detraction and calumny destroy the reputation and honor of another person. To define honor is a social witness given to human dignity. It is a natural right to honor and respect another. When we detract or state these false statements about another, we're somehow undermining their reputation, the honor that is their due. Every word or attitude is forbidden, which by flattery, adulation, or complacence encourages and confirms another in malicious acts or perverse conduct. So adulation is grave if one is an accomplice in grave sin. The desire to serve nor friendship can justify duplicitous speech. Venial when it seeks to be agreeable, avoid evil, meet a need, or obtain legitimate advantages. Flattery or adulation which confirms another in malicious acts or perverse conduct. So if I'm trying to sell you insurance and I flatter you to get you to buy something, that's an insurance sale. That's not malicious acts or perverse conduct. But yet if I'm trying to flatter you into helping me rob a bank because you got the gift of picking locks or something like that, that's a malicious act. And even my words are sinful, trying to get you to come into that act. Boasting or bragging is also an offense. Are we witnessing to the truth? Even if we are, in some cases, this might be generated from the sin of pride. What's our motive behind it? To make sure everybody knows the truth? I'm the best priest there is, at least within 20 feet. So that's the truth anyway. So, irony is aimed at disparaging someone by a malicious caricature. Of course, irony can be done in fun, but when we're despairing someone by this malicious caricature of the person, we're harming truth, we're harming their reputation. Continuing, everybody's favorite, a lie. A lie is speaking a falsehood with the intention of deceiving. It's the work of the devil. Jesus says he's the father of lies. Lying is a direct offense against the truth. It injures, our relationship both to the truth and to our neighbor. The gravity of the lie is measured against the nature of the truth it deforms, the circumstances, the intentions, and the harm suffered. So there's a lot that goes into whether or not it's a grave lie or whether or not it's a white lie. By its nature, lying is condemned. The profanation of speech, since speech is to communicate truth, Culpability is greater when the intention entails a risk to life. So if I'm lying in a way that's going to get somebody hurt, maybe killed, that's definitely great. Can I lie if I'm protecting somebody? Nancy, one of our audience members, is quick to say yes.
Yes, you can.
So,
Yes.
but in some ways, there's often ways to respect the truth and find other ways of speaking. For example, this week we celebrate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. One of the bishops who became a great promoter of the council was St. Athanasius. He was a young priest at the time. But because of more people actually believing the heretical position of Arius, Athanasius' life was in danger. I think if I recall right, he was exiled from Alexandria, Egypt 5 times. One time the soldiers are looking for him, and he gets in the boat on the Nile River and trying to hide and get away from them. And the soldiers come up in another boat and ask, have you seen Athanasius? Is he close? And the person who was piloting the boat says, yes, he's very close to you. They took that to mean they're catching up on him, not realizing that this person was telling the truth because Athanasius was hiding in that boat. Told the truth and still protected him. Oh, and there you get that example also of, did the soldiers have a right to know? From a legal point of view, some would argue yes. From a moral point of view, we would say no. They did not have that right to know. Lie does violence to others. It affects the ability to know, which is a condition of every judgment and decision. Lies affect our ability to know. And often we need that knowledge to make good decisions and good judgments. So, it can sow discord and bring about other evils. It's destructive of society as it undermines trust and breaks social relationships. That last one, just look at our whole politics for the last 10, 15 years. How much lying has gone on and what that has done to us in terms of undermining trust in individuals and institutions, and how many social relationships have been adversely affected. So, every offense committed against justice and truth entails a duty of reparation. So if we lie sinfully, we have a duty to atone for it in some way, correcting the lie, whether it's public or secret. So if I whisper to somebody a lie about dancing, well, if I'm sorry for that, I should go back to that somebody and tell them the truth about dancing, correct myself. If not directly compensated, then moral satisfaction in the name of charity. So this includes even people's reputations. If I harm somebody's reputation, I have a duty to somehow atone for it, to somehow make up for that harm, and do what I can to restore that reputation in the eyes of others. The respect for the truth, the right to communicate, the right to the communication of the truth is not unconditional. It may not always be appropriate to reveal truth. So here we come to trying to answer that question where sometimes we feel justified in a lie. There's better ways. Charity and respect for the truth should dictate response to every request for information or communication. The good and safety of others, respect for privacy, common good are sufficient reasons for being silent. Every now and then, church, state, businesses, you have issues come up where one side, because of their position, are pretty much forced to be silent. They cannot say anything unless it be really taken to court. And this is because of the privacy rights. So, if I dismiss an employee, I, as the employer, can't say I dismiss them because A, B, C, D. I have to respect their rights. The most that I could do probably is if I say I'm having layoffs because we don't have enough money, we're not making a profit, or we cut that position. But if there's any kind of misbehavior that calls a dismissal, I can't publicize that. We dismiss this employee because they weren't doing their job. Now that employee, on the other hand, can say whatever they want. Of course, hopefully it's the truth. Otherwise, it might become their sin of detraction or calumny or outright lying. Now, there are some cases where, because of the common good, I cannot be silent. So if another employer calls and asks for a reference, then I should say the truth in that case. It's one-on-one, and it's done somewhat confidentially between one employer to another employer. Of course, there are certain cases now where the state or the church may oblige us to report certain things. Like any suspicion of child abuse, that has to be reported. So, no one is bound to reveal the truth to someone who does not have the right to know it. So, of course, here we repeat the secret of the sacrament of reconciliation is sacred and cannot be violated. It is a crime in the church to betray a penitent, especially because that's a person who's trying to move beyond their sins. They're not telling the priest with the view to going out and repeating, but they want mercy to move beyond. Professional secrets are to be kept unless grave harm to do so. So, what I was saying earlier about human resources or medical aspects. Private information not to be divulged without grave and a proportionate reason. Everyone should have appropriate reserve concerning the person's private lives. So, even though we talk often about the professional aspect, all of us should respect that privacy. We shouldn't be cozy, we shouldn't be gossipy. We have to always try to get this balance between the common good and individual rights. There's a lot of information available on the internet. I'll get notified if a sex offender moves into the neighborhood, which of course doesn't happen because there's a school here and they can't move in. individual and treating them as who I encounter them to be rather than something that may have happened 5, 10, 20 years ago. So now we come to topics of today, social communications. This is all the more interesting given that catechism came out in the 90s when I don't think even Facebook wasn't that yet. But they did recognize the use of social media and that it's increasing. Information should be at the service of the common good. Society has a right to information based on truth, freedom, justice, and solidarity. You know, this is where a lot of people probably didn't get jobs they wanted. Before Facebook, you probably don't remember, I'm looking at the youngest person in the room, there was something called MySpace. Do any of you remember MySpace? Okay, that's a good sign, because MySpace was like college age Facebook where you post nothing but yourself being drunk and dumb. And employers would go and look for applicants on MySpace and see these pictures and think, I don't want this person working for me. Generally speaking, though, does an employer need to know what you're doing on the weekend? What you're doing on a Friday night? That should probably be kept more private. And maybe it does point, though, to a lapse of judgment that people would share that kind of stuff to the whole world. It's necessary that all members of society meet demands of justice and charity. We should seek to have sound public policy, especially with regard to the social media. And, of course, seeking solidarity, recognizing we're in this all together in a way. Social media can give rise to passivity among users, so we should practice moderation and discipline. And of course, seek well-formed consciences to resist unwholesome influences. The passivity is we make our voice heard in the virtual world and we never do anything in the real world. Somehow we think that's enough. And I'm amazed at people who seem to be always commenting and responding on these social media things. I hardly have time to get on it, so I don't get on it. But other people, it seems, are all over that virtual world. Journalists are obliged to serve the truth and not offend charity. Limit critical judgment of individuals. Of course, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when the catechism came out, I think our journalists were more professional than what we have now. Civil authorities should protect public morality and social progress. Protect the right to reputation and privacy. Well, what I said about journalists and politicians too. Nothing can justify manipulation of public opinion. This is, again, lying to get our way rather than to inform. There is grounds for legitimate debate in societies. People need the information so that we can have that honest debate. Of course, with that, condemns totalitarian states which systematically falsify the truth. Moving on, truth, beauty, and art. Truth carries joy and splendor of spiritual beauty. Truth in words is a rational expression for the intellect. But there's other forms of evoking truth that are beyond words. God does so with creation. Augustine saw the beauty of the created world and led him to believe in God the Creator. Art is a human form of expression beyond the necessities of life. It's a form of practical wisdom, uniting knowledge and skill to give truth in a language accessible to sight or hearing. Not an absolute activity, but ordered and ennobled by the ultimate end of man. This desire for the transcendent, the desire for God, the search for meaning. My mind often goes, even though the lyrics are somewhat pagan, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And especially probably the first time that it was performed. Nowadays, we're surrounded by music. You've got car radios. You see these kids walking on the streets with these, what do they call them, earbuds growing out of their ears, where they're probably listening to music on their phone. We can have music 24/7, but it was only 100 years ago. If you wanted music, you had to find a live performance. You had to make it yourself. There were no recordings. So imagine going into a symphony and hearing that music for the first time, and there's no replay button. You get to hear it again for years until you got that orchestra and choir together to put on another performance. Sacred art is true and beautiful when its form corresponds to its particular vocation, evoking, glorifying, and faith and adoration the mystery of God. So the bishop should do more to promote sacred art. Okay, that's the end of the 8th commandment. Any questions? Crystal clear? So stop detracting, stop gossiping, stop lying, and just learn to say, you don't need to know that. Okay.
I've been working on that, and you really feel gossiping. You really feel boring when somebody asks you a direct question about somebody. And you say, yeah, I know, try not to do that.
You really feel boring when you can't talk about others.
Well, you can't answer their question. You can't answer their question.
Well, then again, I guess if somebody asks you a question about another, generally speaking, there's seldom a need to know. It's not going to change my life that I know what's going on with Joe and Maria. Yet, on the other hand, there may always be that possibility that if I do know, I could do something. And that would at least be the minimum that I'm going to pray for. So, Joe and Maria are battling cancer, or going through a difficult time in their marriage, or struggling to be good parents. Okay, I can say a prayer for that. If that information is given in that sense of requesting prayers, offering prayers, then also you have the spirit of charity at work. If it's done just in the sense of, oh, I didn't know that. What was the point of me knowing that? Any other questions? questions or comments? Okay, 9th and 10th commandments. We'll put these two together. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. Sorry, I left out the H there. When you read this one, you may want to ask that question, how do we get 9 and 10 out of this? It seems like one. I believe this is from the book of Exodus. But when you read the book of Deuteronomy, it's phrased different. And that's where historically the Catholic Church has got 9 and 10. Protestant brothers and sisters often put the 9th and 10th together, and they divide up what we have as the first commandment. You shall not have strange gods before you, and you shall not have graven images. So you can see how the problem is Moses didn't number them. Since the time of Moses, it's been referred to as the Decalogue, the 10 words, the 10 commands. But how to number them? Are we right with dividing 9 and 10, or are they right with dividing 1? Good debate to know, but that's why you'll see different lists. Though, of course, at the end of the day, we both have everything still in the 10 Commandments. So, do not covet. St. John distinguishes 3 kinds of covetousness: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. The 9th commandment forbids carnal concupiscence, the lust of the flesh. The 10th forbids coveting another's goods. By concupiscence, in case if you forgot, we refer to any intense form of human desire. So it's not just in terms of the flesh or sexual. If I have an intense form of desire for alcohol or for sweets, that's called a concupiscence. Christianity has given it particular meaning, this movement of the sensitive appetite, which is contrary to reason and inclines us towards sin. So, my natural bodily desires are moving contrary to reason. It doesn't make sense for me to eat that whole box of chocolates. But I'm being moved towards it. We are a composite being, spirit and body and soul, we often say. The struggle between the two is the heritage of sin and part of our daily experience and part of our spiritual battle. We actually have, philosophers will talk about 3 elements in us that move us to the good. The appetites, which we may also call the emotions. It's based often on bodily desires, needs, reactions. The will, where we seek what we do as good. And reason, which seeks to know the good. That these 3 things which direct us to the good may not always be in accord. Go back to the box of chocolates. I know it's not good for me, but I want it. Do I will it? Well, I'm resisting for now, but let's celebrate the resurrection. So the purification of the heart. The heart is ultimately the seat of the moral personality. We are in a struggle to purify our heart and practice temperance. The sixth beatitude proclaims, "Blessed are the pure of heart. They are those who have attuned their intellects and wills to the demands of God's holiness." And this is achieved chiefly in three areas: charity, chastity, and love of truth, the orthodoxy. The connection is between the heart and the body and our faith. Purity of heart is a precondition for the vision of God. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. It enables one to see God, to see according to God, accept others as neighbors, the temple as a body. Body as a temple, sorry. I read that backwards. But also purity is a battle for us as human beings. Baptism confers on its recipients the grace of purification from all sins. Once baptized, all sins prior to baptism are wiped away, including the original sin. But, there's always a but, the baptized must continue to struggle against concupiscence and these disordered desires. Even though we got the grace of baptism to forgive sins, it doesn't remove the effect of the original sin, which is this concupiscence, this disorder in us between our will, intellect, and appetite. With grace, we can prevail by virtue and the gift of chastity, which lets us love with an upright and undivided heart. By purity of intention, which consists in seeking our true end. By simplicity of vision, which seeks to fulfill God's will in everything. And by purity of vision, both external and internal, and then of course by prayer. Different ways to engage in this battle. That upright, undivided of heart, which has a pure intention, seeking the good. The simplicity, I want to do God's will, not my own. Purity of vision, I'm controlling my eyes, both internal and external, and I'm resorting to prayer. Purity requires modesty, which is again a sub-virtue of temperance. Why do we dress ourselves? Ultimately, there should be two reasons. The modesty, because, hey, I don't want to distract you by my great physique. Thank you. Dad bod, father bod. And also to protect the body. Keep it warm, keep it functioning, so on, keep it from getting sunburned, whatever it may be. We weren't made to be peacocks with fancy feathers to attract women. God didn't give us those feathers. So the clothes we make are to help us with this modesty. I should be trying to flaunt myself for any reason. The clothing doesn't serve the purpose of modesty and protection, and maybe I should look at changing my wardrobe. And this ultimately is to protect ourselves too. It's this refusal to unveil things that are more properly hidden, that are kept for the spouse, not for everybody else. So, modesty protects the mystery of persons, and then In marriage, it protects their love. The decency, choice of clothing, silent or reserved in matters of unhealthy curiosity, this discretion. So there is bringing in some elements of communication here. That again, the things that go on between a husband and a wife in a bedroom, that's nobody else's business. Except the doctor if there's a baby on the way. Continuing on the battle for purity. Modesty of feeling as well as of the body. This protest against all that corrupts. When we see images in movies or of the pornography that might pop up on your different what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say live feeds, but how some of these applications on the internet bring up, this is suggested for you, and this might come next, or an advertisement. They're trying to often to attract us by the beauty of the human body. Do we see that as something that draws us in, or do we protest it because it somehow is corrupting our nature? That we're almost repulsed by it in a way. That would be if we had the modesty of feelings, that we would not be attracted to such images. Forms of modesty vary from culture to culture. Here in the U.S., women are even encouraged and probably expected to be modest when they're breastfeeding and cover themselves up. In Africa and a lot of places, there wasn't a second thought about that. By our standards, there would be nothing considered modest about it. But by the African standard, there was nothing considered sexual about it. This is what we do as human beings. We feed our children. Christian purity requires purification of the social climate, freedom from eroticism and entertainment, which is inclined to voyeurism and illusion. Moral permissiveness rests on erroneous conceptions of human freedom. Ultimately, we need to know the commandments, we need an education in moral law, to not see this as self-expression, but to see it as somehow immodest, corrupting, because it's ultimately distorting human dignity by making us sexual objects rather than persons to encounter. Of course, there's always a need for Christ to continually renew life and culture. I remember, I won't throw my one sister under the bus. So, remember coming home back in the 90s, I think it was at seminary, and parents were in the front room, she was in the family room, and she was watching one of those shows that probably had a little too much, this would have been in the 90s, so a little too much kissing. I don't know if it would have had any nudity back then. But I noticed that my sister had the volume very, very low, so that my parents couldn't tell what she was watching. Because if Dad was in the room, Dad would have the remote control, and Dad would change the station. But it's a good example of how parents can try to teach their children more about this modesty. That if you see things coming on that are opposed to it, switch channels. Weather Channel's always good in terms of modesty. So, the 10th commandment completes the 9th. It forbids coveting goods, which is the root of all that the 7th commandment forbids. Thou shalt not steal. The lust of eyes leads to violence, which is forbidden by the 5th commandment. And it can lead to avarice, like fornication originates in idolatry, the first 3 commandments. So, the disorder of covetous desires. Our sensitive appetites lead us to pleasant things we do not have. I'm hungry, I want food. I'm thirsty, I want water. These are pleasant things that I don't have, which is why I'm hungry and thirsty. And these desires are good in themselves, but they often exceed the limits of reason. Even our sexual desires are seen as a good, because it leads us to go out and meet another who might become a spouse, and then it leads us to the joys of family life and fulfillment of being with others, because as God said in the beginning, it is not good for us to be alone. So, forbids greed and desire to amass earthly goods without limits. This avarice arising from passion for wealth and attendant power. And of course then forbids harming the neighbor because he has goods. Don't know if it was with this group that I mentioned it. We did this little number thing in Africa. I forget how much Bill Gates was worth at the time. But we kind of estimated that he would live, I think we assumed he was in his 50s, and that he would live at least another 20 years. So 20 years times 365 days, whatever that number is, probably 9,000, 10,000 maybe, less than that. And then we divided that into his money to get how much money would he have to spend each day to die penniless. It's like $50 million a day. Spend that a year, in a year you can find it that much.
Was that without earning any more?
Without earning any more, just to use it all up. Yeah, who needs that kind of wealth?
He has donated a lot.
You can probably donate a heck of a lot more. There's no reason for that kind of wealth. It's not a violation to desire to obtain things that belong to another if it's done by just means. So if I want your money, I can desire to obtain it by a just means. I can come work for you. I can sell you something I have. My chickens are dropping eggs. You need some. Any of those things would be seen as just means. Envy should be banished from our heart. It is considered a capital sin. It is the sadness at the sight of another's goods and an immoderate desire to acquire them for oneself. That can lead to a refusal of charity. We should struggle against it by exercising goodwill. Envy always risks becoming pride, the 2 sins of the angels, because they don't have bottoms, are envy and pride. And the angels could be envious of us because we can taste chocolate. We can smell coffee and drink it. We can have marital things don't get. Having talked about the body, what about the desires of the spirit? Law and grace turn hearts away from avarice and envy. We should desire the sovereign good, God. Instruct in desire of the Holy Spirit who satisfies the heart. If we get caught up into the things of this world, we get the fruits of the flesh. If we get caught up into the higher things, we get the fruits of the Spirit. And that's where we find our hearts are truly satisfied. The law was entrusted to Israel, but it never sufficed to justify. There was a gap between wanting and doing, which point to a conflict between God's law and another law, the law of sin. The righteousness of God manifested in faith in Jesus Christ. The faithful have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Yes, it's a battle, but this crucifixion of our bodily desires, our appetites, is to free us to seek the higher things. To this, the poverty of heart, being poor in spirit, as Jesus says, the first beatitude. Jesus enjoins his disciples to prefer him to everything and everyone else. This detachment from riches. We are to leave father and mother and lands and children and wife to follow him. Faithful are to direct their affections rightly, lest they be hindered in their pursuit of charity. The poor in spirit, Beatitudes reveals the order of happiness and grace, beauty and peace. There is joy in those who are poor. Almost every missionary will tell you they've worked among dirt poor people. Those dirt poor people always seem happier than Americans. Their hearts were set on the higher things because they had nothing else. The higher things being God and their family and friends. The Lord grieves over the rich because they find consolation only in the abundance of goods. The abandonment to providence frees us from anxiety. I've often said and seen how we think we own property, but more often than not, it's the property that owns us. Priests who bought cottages or places to live thinking that's where they're going to retire to. Well, while they're active priests, their days off mean they have to go to that place and cut the grass, maintain the house. And then they're always begging the bishop not to send them far from that property. So if I bought my cottage in the Irish Hills, I don't want to go to Mansfield. That adds 2 hours to the drive. So it ties us up in many ways. Trust in God is preparation for the blessedness of the poor. That we put our hope in him, not on the things we possess. Ultimately, the desire to see God. Desire for true happiness frees us from immoderate attachment to goods. Our fulfillment is in the vision of God, beatific vision, as St. Thomas Aquinas would write about. Remains for us to struggle with God's grace to obtain all these good things promised by him. We need to struggle by controlling our desires, mortifying our cravings, as it says, disciplining ourselves. On the way to perfection, the the Spirit and the bride call whoever hears them to communion. The Spirit and the church, I should say the groom also, are calling us to this more intimate communion. Any questions on 9 and 10? Yes, Ruth.
I have a question about the concupiscence.
Yes.
Okay, that came from the original sin.
Yes.
Okay, so Adam and Eve didn't have concupiscence.
Correct.
So why did they sin if they didn't have the desire to sin?
Good question. You'll have
You
to
need
ask
to
them.
repeat that?
I need to repeat that so anybody listening can hear. Rita's making the point that concupiscence comes from the original sin. And then if Adam and Eve didn't have concupiscence, why did they sin? It was a freely chosen sin. It is only after they kind of give in to the lies, going back to the 8th commandment, of the serpent, those lies about you will be like God, that only then that the woman sees that it was good for eating. So it was first this appeal to pride and envy, desire to be like God. And that's more of an appeal to her intellect. She chooses to want this, believes in the lie, sees that it's good for eating, the appetites coming into play, and then she eats. Adam and Eve, like the only other two people we know without original sin, Jesus and Mary, have their intellect, will, and appetites all directing towards sin. Adam and Eve made that free choice to disobey God. Jesus and Mary, thankfully, their choices were always to do God's will.
How would Eve know what a lie was? She had never experienced it, so with the devil tempting her.
How would Eve have known what a lie was, since she had never experienced it? What the serpent was saying to Eve contradicted what God said. Why did she believe the serpent over God? Maybe there is also an element of lack of faith, lack of trust in God. That basically the serpent did say, God lied to you. I'm the one telling you the truth. You won't die. Go ahead and eat.
She didn't? No. She didn't. She didn't die. No.
But she ate.
Yeah.
And she eventually died. Not immediately. So. Good questions. So do you know what they say in terms of how easy it's going to be to recognize Adam and Eve when you get to heaven?
You don't have belly buttons. Is that it?
They will be the only people who don't have that.
Belly buttons.
Nancy, you look confused.
Well, no, I wouldn't be looking for them anyway.
Oh. The belly buttons or Adam and Eve?
Adam and Eve,
Oh, okay.
and other people I'm gonna be looking for.
It's gonna be so crowded.
Well,
I hope so.
thankfully Jesus says there are many rooms in my Father's house. So I hope I get a private corner room.
We're going back to Adam and Eve, and we're all gonna rise, have our bodies.
Yeah, but we're not all going to necessarily go to heaven.
Majority.
They tradition says that with the fall of the angels, 1/3 of them fell. So with the fall of man, we got to judge.
When you talk about the angels' fall, they didn't have concupiscence, did they?
No?
So, was theirs pride?
So, question is related to the fall of the angels and whether or not they had concupiscence. No, they do not, because that's related to our sensitive appetites, our bodily nature. Without a body, they could not have it. Their sin is the sin of pride and envy. And it is